Hello, everybody. My name is Michael Harkey. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Today's webinar is Contract Review Part 2 for those brave enough and insomniacs. And now on to the main event. I'd like to introduce you to our speaker. He is a managing partner here at Infotex, a MSSP provider and IT audit firm, the awareness guru of Indiana, the man with 13 letters after his name, and he doesn't use any of them for his passwords. Dan Hadaway. Dan?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael. Can you hear me okay? This is a new headset.
Yeah, you sound great.
All right, great. Well, hey, it's traditional that I give a shout out. Is Matt Jolly in the attendee list, Mike?
Sure is.
Matt Jolly is. Well, hey, Matt, thanks a lot for your help last month, and I appreciate that. I also would like to give a shout out to Google, to Citrix, to all those big companies, Microsoft, who, let's face it, we're not going to get them to change their contracts, which is kind of what our webinar is about today. Starting off with the fact that what we're really doing when we review a contract that we know we don't have the power to change is we're still measuring the legal risks that we are exposed to when working with a third party. Some of those companies that I just named, or maybe one or more of those companies, I should say, but I happen to know that there are large companies out there who, when you actually look at their contract, they're actually promising not to protect your information. They're saying, under no circumstances does this contract include any protections of information. And we realize that there's no way they can actually enforce something like that. And we realize that they're big enough to where, they have much more legal risk than any kind of, contract risk. They can get sued no matter what their contract says, of course. But what we want to do is we want to make sure that we understand the relationship, even with contracts that we can't change. And the good news is, by the way, there are a lot of contracts out there that will be changed. There are a lot of vendors out there that are more than happy to change their contract to fit your needs. And if we can just identify where the contracts could be changed, that can arm our vendor owners with information that they need the next time it's time to negotiate the contract. Finally, one of the things I've noticed as I'm reviewing contracts for new vendors is that if I'm looking at a contract where there's no protections whatsoever, that information security is not even mentioned in the contract, well, that tells me a little bit about the vendor. It might mean that the vendor's not used to working with companies that require security in their contract, as an example. And so, we can really, in a non-formal manner, learn a lot about a vendor just by reviewing their contracts. So as you can imagine, the name of this webinar is Contract Review Part 2 for those brave enough and insomniacs. And so I have a pretty aggressive agenda that I'd like to go through this morning. It might take longer than an hour. If so, we're not going to be offended if you, disconnect and, come back and watch the rest of the webinar when it's in the movie format. But I do fully intend to go fully through the checklist that is based on the OCC guidance. This webinar is not for people who didn't understand what I just said. So if you're a vendor management, coordinator, and you don't know what I mean by the OCC guidance, it could be because you're governed by the FDIC or you're governed by the NCOA or the Fed, and you just aren't aware of the fact that the OCC guidance is the most recent regurgitation of what the FFIEC has been saying all along about vendor management in general, and the OCC guidance really did a great job of laying out everything we should look for in a contract. The only problem is the OCC says that you have to look for it in a contract if you're governed by the OCC. The last webinar we did about contract review, at least, was meant for vendor owners. And so what actually happened is that we had a few people that went to that webinar that said, hey, this is great. I'm going to show the movie to our vendor owners, but they needed more. They wanted to know, well, what are we supposed to do when we look at the contract, because we are the ones that are responsible for reviewing the contract. I know there's audit clients out in the audience right now that are looking at findings in an audit saying that you need to have a more formalized method of contract review. And I know that we sell Track. We're resellers of Track, but there's other great risk management applications out there, including End Contracts, by the way, which I should have probably done a shout out to End Contracts and Digital Compliance, two firms that are actually in the business of reviewing contracts, along with other vendor management due diligence type workflow applications. And yet what we're finding is that some of our clients are needing to, supplement those applications with more robust contract review, or, with spreadsheets and checklists that they'll upload to the application, but they really like the ability to be able to customize the actual contract review itself, and their applications aren't allowing that. And yes, we do have clients out there that we do contract review for. And they might be looking at some of their less critical clients, or maybe, I want to do a quick contract review before I turn it over to Infotex, because if Infotex is going to shoot it down and I already know that in advance, I save the money, whatever. I totally understand that. You don't need to log in under a pseudonym next time. And then, of course, there's information security professionals.
Dan.
And vendor management.
Hey, Dan.
Yo.
Hey,
Yes,
can
Mike.
you quote on the prerequisites? I mean, I think most of this was in the registration, and
Well,
you already said it was
yeah,
going to be a long webinar, so.
all right. Yeah, sure. I'll cool it on the prerequisites. I was gonna offer $1 million to the first person who could guess.
Go ahead then.
No. That's okay. But this
sorry,
webinar is also for insomniacs. And if you're still awake, don't worry, because we're going to be talking about a big part of what the people who do have the right prerequisites call their vendor management program. And this includes, and what's very important is that we sort our vendors by inherent risk or criticality, what we used to call a threshold analysis way back when we first started trying to interpret what the FFIEC was saying, all its disparate guidances. And so our point being is that a contract review to the level that I'm going to be showing today is probably not something that's meant for moderate risk or regulated vendors, although, it'd be interesting to see what the Equifax contract says if we, want to, take and circle back around and take a look at what we mean by regulated vendors. But no, contract review is usually something that, maybe our moderate risk vendors, we're wanting them to promise availability and non-disclosure, but we're certainly not going to look through the contract to the degree that I'm going to be showing today. If you have access to information, or if you host information, then we need to make sure there's certain provisions in the contract where you're agreeing to protect that information. And so a threshold analysis is, if you're here and you're still awake and you're still listening to this webinar, I think you realize that it's whatever you're using right now to sort your vendors based on the type of services that they're providing, in terms of, what type of access or possession of information do they have, what type of availability risk do they represent to the institution, or it could just be that they're very expensive vendors, and so we want to make sure that we understand their contract because of that reason. I want to spend a little bit of time explaining why we're here. And no, I'm not going to go through an overall vendor management program. That's the reason why it's a prerequisite. But I just want to, point out that contract review is one of the, major components of a vendor management program. It's what your examiners and auditors are testing for now. They feel like you've, done a good job of getting, your arms around the SOC 2 reviews, and you're doing a good job of reviewing financial statements and insurance. And so now we're wanting to zoom in on contract review. And mainly because we're not seeing a lot of issues with contracts showing up in the final deliverables, what we can test. If we look at your board report and we look at what you've said to the board about vendor management, we can tell whether or not you're doing a good contract review. And the reason why is because very often some of the risk that we would report to the board results from contract issues. And so, yes, there's a lot of people involved in the entire process. Obviously, when we're talking contracts, we're working with the salesperson, but a lot of times we're working through the salesperson to the compliance or the legal departments team. And just so you know, we had a vendor that we thought, was going to really do well. They had a SOC 2. We reached out saying, hey, all we have is the cover page from your SOC 2. They put us in touch with their legal department, and their legal department actually started acting all litigious, or I don't know the word for it, but they were going to sue us if we asked further questions or whatever. And so we're like, oh, okay, well, thanks. And then we had to spend the next month or two or so trying to help the salesperson understand that no matter how nice you are, if these people want to sue us, we're not going to do business with you. And so the contract review really does say a lot about the client if we really look at it from more of an awareness process rather than just a compliance or a legal risk mitigation process. And so just as a reminder, what we're really doing with the contract review is it's part of the due diligence request. And yes, I admit this chart used to only have the first 3 items in that list there, but contract is obviously a big part of what we're looking at when we engage with a new vendor especially, but then also throughout the vendor management cycle, as the OCC calls it, we're going to identify things that we want to add to the contract, maybe via addendum or the next time the contract is up for renewal. And hopefully we will be able to identify missing controls, risk rank those controls, maybe get back with the vendor and develop addendi or whatever the plural of addendums is, and report to the board, of course, anything that might represent higher critical risk that we can't address. And again, here's my shout out again to Google, Microsoft, Citrix, and all those big boys who just simply aren't going to change their contract for us. We still need to recognize the risk and help the board understand that, yes, from a compliance perspective, Google is promising that, whatever. And I don't want to characterize their promise because they offer many services and there's many different contracts for various services. But if we don't like what's in a Microsoft or a Citrix or, another, multinational player's contract, as a small bank, we're not going to get it to change. And that goes back again to why whole point is what we're doing is we're implementing an awareness process. Not only is the awareness a big part of what we're achieving with a contract review, but then we're also going to respond to the risk that is present in the missing controls from a contract perspective. And so if, for an example, our cleaning people don't do background checks, then we're not going to accept that risk. We need to know who's coming into our branches, unless it's our niece or our, cousin or whatever. I understand with smaller banks, a lot of times there's those reasons we can make exceptions or really risk rank the issue lower because we know the niece, we know the cousin or whatever. But the point is that we are going to respond to the risk. And then also maybe part of that will be to get them to modify the contract. But if we don't get them to modify the contract, we still may be able to implement mitigating controls. And of course, you all know that I believe that awareness is 9/11ths of the battle. And that in itself is one of the mitigating controls, as long as we're making our vendor owners aware of the weaknesses in the contract. And so if you remember in the last webinar, we talked about the 4 fundamental promises, and this was training fodder for your vendor owners that, hey, if they can't meet these 4 promises, they're not going to be able to get through my contract review. But there's still other parts of the contract review that you'll see that might not fall under these 4 fundamental promises, usually representing lower risk than not being able to make one of these promises represents if you have access to or possession of information. And therefore, from our perspective at least, we probably won't disappoint our vendor owners if they can get these 4 promises. We will just have work to do in order to manage the legal risk and respond to the risk of additional promises that might not be met. And you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about when we get to the contract review checklist. So there are a few myths out there. One, that we can't change the contract is what this slide should say. Well, that's what we hear. is we can't change the contract. We'll have to bring in our lawyers. You don't want the lawyers involved. Well, if you have to bring in your lawyers, that's fine. But if there's an issue that represents higher critical risk, the easiest way for us to, mitigate that risk is to outsource the mitigation by requiring the vendor to do the right thing in the first place. Now, be careful. A vendor can't just add something to a contract, and now they're doing it in many cases. And as a good example is the horror story of a vendor I worked with a long time ago, about 2006. They were a network support provider for a small community-based bank, and they started off refusing to comply with Gramm-Leach-Bliley because they didn't know what that law meant. Well, then they came back later and said, yeah, never mind, we're in compliance with Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And we were like, boy, even though you're willing to put that in the contract, we're kind of wondering, are you really in compliance with a law that, just last month, you didn't even know what the law meant. So that's a big contract myth that can be broken, by the way, if you're working with a vendor that does have controls in place by writing an addendum to require those controls. And very often, if you look at a vendor's due diligence packet, what they're providing to you before they find out what's not in their contract, which might not be in the form of a nice, neat due diligence packet, of course, but whatever the assurance documents are being provided right off the get-go, you can write addendums to say, hey, you're saying you're doing this. Here's an addendum that says you're doing it in legal speak. Can you sign this, please? So when we review a contract, and this is a very high level, list of what we actually kind of look at. And what I want to make sure you realize is small community-based banks aren't going to have a requirements definition, even probably for some of your most complex contracts. But we still have in mind what we want out of a contract. And I'm not going to really walk through each of these points in the amount of detail as I normally would. And the reason why is because we're going to walk through the actual checklist that addresses all of these points. But back before the OCC guidance that was released, by the way, in October of 2013, seems like just yesterday to me, but back before that guidance consolidated all of the FFIEC guidance about contract review and vendor management in general, we have these slides to kind of pull it all together. And we didn't know, and we couldn't find anywhere in the FFIEC guidance that said, make sure you have a signed contract. But it was something we always would find when we audited banks, that they couldn't find that they went through all the work of doing a risk assessment. They dotted every I and crossed every T. They didn't dot any ties, but they were probably wearing ties when they did this, because this was back in the day before banks loosened up their dress code policy, right? And so the point being is that when we went to audit the contract, they didn't have a signed copy of it. They forgot to get that back after jumping through all the hoops that they jumped through to get the contract right. So our checklist is based on the OCC guidance as we found it. And then when they came out with their new guidance in 2013, we updated it. We were happy to see that we were missing a couple things, and a couple of things that we had that wasn't really in the FFIEC guidance, like making sure there's a signed copy. Our checklist was pretty good, but I also want to make sure you see this here. The contract management is what the OCC is calling for. The contract review is just one part of contract management. In my opinion, it's where you collect the metrics of contract management. So when does the contract expire? What price thresholds are we supposed to look at? When are they supposed to provide what to us, et cetera, et cetera. But contract management is more than just contract review. And so now we're ready to talk about the actual contract checklist. I mean, this is the tactical level of a contract review. For those of you who are insomniacs, I believe this is, if you're still not asleep, this is where, rest assured, you'll be waking up tomorrow fully rested. Before we go into the actual checklist, though, what I want to say is that we need to review a contract. And so We felt like if we were to review any of the contracts that we have with third parties or any fake contracts or whatever, we could get into trouble because we're going to, identify issues with contracts in front of everybody, or it just won't translate to real life or whatever. And so what we decided to do is we're just going to go ahead and bring up our normal template that we use for our managed security services contract and review it against our contract checklist. I'm pretty sure we're in real good compliance with the OCC guidance, so I'm hoping at least that you won't see what contract issues look like, but we'll see how that goes. But this is just our typical managed services contract. The way it's organized is we have a service level agreement. That this is the dynamic part. This is the part that changes from client to client, and then the static part is a service agreement. We have some sign-off forms, and then we will have addendums from time to time. If there's a 3-year commitment, we offer a discount. And there's actually provisions for early termination there. But also a lot of times we'll add in incident response testing or training of the incident response team or social engineering testing, whatever. And we'll take care of that with addendums as well. And if anybody wants a modification to the static part of the contract, that's the tool we use to modify that. Now, I know that a lot of banks will be told, well, this is a standard contract. We don't want to get the lawyers involved, et cetera, et cetera. But just so you know, if we do need to modify this part of the contract, we can with an addendum. We might get our lawyers involved just to make sure we know what we're doing to our overall commitment. But more often, we actually get our insurance company involved because we're actually changing the contract that we had submitted to them when they asked us for our contracts, when they were writing the data privacy and cybersecurity and those types of policies. And so we want to make sure that they'll still cover this agreement, and we get what's called a rider on the agreement. So I want to, just kind of, establish that is the contract we're going to review. I also want to kind of lay some context here. Most of you are sorting your vendors from an inherent risk perspective into those who have possession of information, those who have access to information, and everybody else. And then, there's exceptions. There might be somebody that doesn't have any possession of information, but their availability is so important that they're still in that top tier, even though they only have access to information. Or, we have some vendors maybe that have no possession, no access, but their availability is so important that maybe they'll be in that second tier. What we see happening with our clients who use us to watch their networks or provide a SIEM to them, a security information event management system, is some clients will say Infotex has access to systems, so they're a tier 2 vendor, they're a level 2 vendor, they're a high risk, not a critical risk vendor, all depending on what your nomenclature is. But some of our clients, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I feel like they are doing their due diligence well, and they've decided that we're a little bit different, that yes, we do have access, not possession of information, but we have persistent access, meaning that we're connected to the client's network 24/7. And even though we do not have any possession of NPI or PII, if somebody compromised Infotex, they might be able to leverage that compromise to compromise the client's network, and it makes them feel a little less comfortable than they would with, a company that maybe has remote access into the organization, but it's not persistent access. And so some organizations will consider Infotex to be a critical risk or a tier 1 vendor. And we're good with that because we've set our due diligence, our security posture to be able to comply with the due diligence requests that we would recommend you ask of a critical risk vendor. And really what you also want to make sure you realize is that part of your goal while you're doing the contract review, especially if the contract review's out to the due diligence packet, is that you should be cross-checking everything with the due diligence packet. So I also want to quickly go over Infotex's due diligence packet because it's what kind of will back up sometimes the gray areas in the contract. And so as an example, Google if you read their contract, you'll see that they promise, not only do they not promise to protect your information, but they actually come right out and say that, hey, you can't, we're not promising to protect your information. But you can see in their due diligence packet that they have all kinds of legal risk mitigation. They have assurance documents. They, have good insurance, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, that even though, if you were to try to sue them, they can say, well, not only do we not promise to protect your information, but we even said we wouldn't protect your information. Well, actually, they are protecting your information. You can tell that by your due diligence packet. It makes it a little bit easier to lower the likelihood rating on the finding that you're going to have if you're using that part of Google where they are promising not to protect your information. And by the way, I also want to make sure for my own legal risk purposes that I say that not all Google systems have that in their contract. But our contract then has that assurance document. We do provide financial statements. We have certificates of insurance, and we have two documents that are probably referred to in our contract, the client control considerations and the limitations of the system, that are very important documents that should be, that when we actually do our annual reviews with our clients, we point them out to them and make sure they have a copy of them. And so the tools that you have available to do this contract review, of course, is your policy and your procedure and the inherent risk assessment where you sorted your vendors out. You've already done your assurance review. You've looked at the insurance. You've looked at the financial statements. And now it's time to get to the tedious review of comparing the contract against the contract review checklist. We actually have two. One's a simplified one for your high-risk vendors, and then one matches that OCC guidance to the letter. And then we also have an addendum template in case your vendor is struggling putting together an addendum. It's a lot easier if you just write up what you want the addendum to say and send it to them. And then we have an agreement template, which really is not a four corners contract. We're not lawyers. It's just language starting points that you can use if you ever want something added into an agreement because your contract review exposes that it's not in the agreement. A lot of times for your more local, higher risk clients, my favorite example is cleaning companies where they might not have the non-disclosure agreement. We have a template that you can use for that as well. Again, I want to remind you, we're not attorneys. We're not saying that this contract review template is going to make sure that the contract is sound. It's just going to make sure it has language in it that addresses what the OCC guidance wants all contracts to have. And I think it's behind that, but I just want to stress this is the OCC guidance we're shooting for. At the FDIC, the NCUA, the Fed is a little more scalable than the OCC. If you are an OCC bank, we've got a single location OCC bank that's being required to meet their guidance to the letter. And then finally, we also have a vendor risk determination table, which is where you actually put all the resulting findings so that it's easier for you to sort out what you do find in relationship to each other and decide what gets reported to the board versus what's just tracked. And so it's my understanding, Michael, that you've provided these documents. You there, Michael?
Yes, I am.
Okay, great. This kind of reminds me where I want to go now is actually into the checklist itself, but I do realize we have a promise to those insomniacs. And so I hope that the rest of you who are actually wanting to learn how to review a contract can bear with us here. But I do really feel like it's time now to move a little bit further towards the deliverables to the insomniacs. What we're going to do now is very, very, very calmly review what the contract review checklist includes at a high level. Of course, we have the template that's in all of our boilerplates, but then we have a simplified checklist for our high-risk customers. And, just know that the difference is the simplified checklist is only 22 questions long, whereas the OCC checklist is more than 52 questions long. It's 53 questions. Hey, Michael.
Oh, yeah, Dan.
Hey, there was somebody snoring. Can you mute that? Was that you?
Oh, no, I can take care of that. I'll mute them.
Okay. Hey, if you're still awake and you're an insomniac, I'm sorry. I feel like we're going to start putting the rest of the attendants asleep, and so I'm sorry, but I feel like, I mean, Michael loves contract review and vendor management, don't you, Mike?
Oh
And
boy, yes I do.
and I know you didn't go to sleep. I know you didn't fall asleep or anything, but
No, never, not me.
were you having a hard time staying awake?
Eyes were just a little heavy,
Okay.
just a little
Okay.
heavy.
All right. Well, I tell you what, then I'm going to keep the new age music out of this. And we're going to try to focus the rest of this webinar. And I know we're going way over on time here, but let's keep it focused on delivering what the people who do want to learn how to review a contract need to hear. And for those of you who are still awake and you're just trying to go to sleep, we're sorry. Um, and so. You're going to find that some of these questions in this checklist are, well, boy, that goes without saying. And yet, we often, as auditors, will find that we didn't follow through enough to get the actual signer of the contract, to get a signed contract and executed, contract. And so it's good to check to make sure that we've got the right signer and all that sort of thing. I'm going to have to pretend like we do in the case of the review of the Infotext contract because it's a fake contract. So, I mean, if you go to where, the contract is signed, which I think is somewhere around page 17 or whatever, you're going to see that it's not signed. Now, maybe what I ought to do, just for the sake of helping you sort risk out and showing how that works, is I'm going to say, oh, oops, no, I'm not seeing the signed contract. And so, of course, before you would say no in the checklist, you'd probably get with the vendor owner and then discover vendor owner is reaching out to retrieve the signed copy. Okay, and so, so the answer to this question is no, we don't have a signed contract. And so what's the risk of that? I feel like it's compliance or legal risk. And so in my analysis, I always put, hey, if it's going to expose, everybody's information, I'm going to give it a 5. If it's an individual breach and, in other words, we didn't lose all of our customers' information or a whole bunch of customers' information, but we only lost one person, I'm going to give that a 4 on the impact of scale of 1 to 5. If it's compliance or legal, I'll give it a 3 unless it's one of those scary legal risks, then I might give it a 4. Or unless it's in a cease and desist or something, maybe I give it a 5. Right? Compliance risk is pretty high if they're threatening to publish our report or whatever. So, but in this case, I think it's more of like a 3 on the impact scale. And then from a likelihood perspective, I usually, start at a 5. Is it greater than, a 5? Or is it less than a 5? That this would cause problems. And so to me, the only time this is really going to cause a problem is if we get into litigation and they can say, well, no, you don't have a signed contract or whatever. So I'm going to go with a little bit lower than a 5. And so the end up risk score there, by the way, ends up being a 7. If we look at our ranking sheet, in the back there, a 7 is kind of the low end of moderate risk. That kind of makes sense to me. But I also want you to know for the rest of this webinar, I'm not going to get that much detailed into the risk rankings. I'm just going to put my best guess in there. Hopefully, we won't be risk ranking a lot because hopefully the Infotext contract is in pretty decent compliance with the OC guidance. Has it been reviewed by an attorney? We're going to say that most banks are probably not shipping our contract out to be reviewed by an attorney. They might have somebody in-house look at the contract that decides whether they should have an attorney review it or not. But I don't see a lot of times, and maybe my clients are having attorneys review it, and they're not, telling me that they're having their attorneys review it. I don't know, but we don't have a lot of back and forth with law firms when we're going through our engagement process with potential clients, and so, and yet, we have to say, no, we're not having it reviewed by an attorney. So what's the risk of that? Well, to me, it's more legal risk again. And I feel like the likelihood of not having an attorney causing problems is probably higher than the likelihood of not having it signed. So now I'm kind of like at a 5 there, and I'm actually taking that down to a 3. Moving along, the costs, are they fully described? Well, in the interest of time, what you'll have to do is you have to kind of go looking for all the cost information. And I strongly encourage you, you got to read every contract from start to finish. You might scan read the legal jargon when you get to, liabilities or indemnification or whatever. But you got to get familiar with the contract. What's going to make this webinar take a little bit less time is that I'm already familiar with the contract, and I happen to know that the fee structure is addressed in the service level agreement, but we also have payment terms and what we're going to charge for replacement sensors and that sort of thing addressed in the static part. But here's where we're identifying all the costs that's going to happen in the contract. We're we're establishing what the costs are based on, and then once you get into the contract, if you search for a dollar sign, it might be the easy way to kind of find stuff. Again, having read the whole contract, you should have at least made a note that replacement hardware is addressed somewhere in the contract. And so now we're looking at 2250, 2650. If you're not the vendor owner, you might want to bring to the vendor owner's attention that, hey, do you realize that there's something besides that you told me that you really kind of looked at this page for, but once you got the contract, you turned it over to me. Well, do you realize that Infotex is going to be charging this kind of money for replacement hardware? And when we zoom down a little bit further, I kind of lost my place there, so I'm going to search for the dollar sign again. What they're really saying is that they'll replace it for free in the first 2 years, but after 2 years, if something goes wrong with the sensor, we have to pony up another $2250 or $1800 if we're buying a bunch of them. We have to pony up $2650 if it's what they call an ELM sensor. Okay, and so that's kind of the process that you're going through. At the end of it, the vendor owner is going to be like, well, yeah, they mentioned that. I didn't see it in the front page, but yeah, I'm good with that, and everything adds up to what we thought it was going to be. But you're right, we didn't catch that in the replacement fees. And then the other thing you might also point out, I just realized about the Infotex contract related to payments and that sort of thing. But termination is kind of important, and one of the things we'll be looking for later is, do we have any kind of ability to terminate? Well, yes, there is, but if you notice, it basically says that, however, if you do terminate early, we want our discounts back. And so that might be something that we also point out to the vendor owner. I'm really big on documenting whatever we point out to the vendor owner. So vendor owner is aware of replacement fees for sensors, the termination, early termination policy, I guess we could call that. And then, of course, the what else is the vendor owner aware of? And then all fees expressed on page 4. And then, by the way, the contract refers to that as the SLA page. And so, but I feel like hey, the contract's in compliance with that. We understand what the fees are going to be. Does it document the expected services? It does all over the place. That service level agreement is kind of the where we identify what we're going to do for this particular engagement, right? So we're saying we're installing, 5 sensors, 1 virtual sensor. We've got setup, tuning, and training of up to 36 hours. We're providing managed services. We've got both the internal and the external network covered. We've got change detection, and we've got event log management going on. We're going to be managing up to 20 devices. This is kind of weird because it says 10 here instead of 20, but that's because we gave 20 devices at the 10 device price. Don't tell anybody that we've been doing that from time to time. I know that some of my clients are listening to this, but the overall price is what we negotiated with you, is the best I could say about that. This is actually a 5-year commitment that we had with this particular, redacted agreement. By the way, we use a template, but for this, since it changes every time, we usually just go into the last one we use and that sort of thing. So we don't really have a template for this. We redacted an existing agreement, had 2 different people look at it to make sure we're not revealing the name of clients, that sort of thing. But suffice it to say, that's just kind of pointing out what we're doing. How we're doing it is really in the actual agreement. So we spell out how we're going to deploy intrusion detection, how we're going to deploy the creation of network incident response processes, how we're going to be deploying change detection. And you'll notice, if called for in the SLA, we are actually trained to collect evidence. We are not forensics analysts, but given that we're usually there very often when evidence needs to be collected, We have people that have write blockers and that whole thing. But a lot of our clients really don't want to invest in that, or their insurance company's covering a different company or whatever, and that's totally cool. So, it's worded if it's in the SLA. And so what really needs to happen is when you do your contract review, what you're doing when you answer this question right here is you're really making sure that the vendor owner has read and understands all the written part of the description of what we're going to be doing. And so how do you know the vendor owner's done that? I know some banks are just assuming it. If I was the ISO, I would probably quiz my vendor owner about it, because I worry that the vendor owners are so busy that they hate legalese, and that they might not realize some of the, hey, do you realize that this refers to a limitations of the system document? And I'm looking, I don't see our due diligence packet at my disposal right now. I disconnect from our network when I do these webinars. I wish I can bring it up, but the limitations of the system document is an important document that the vendor owner should review. And so what I would say on this one is that expected services are articulated, and the vendor owner has reviewed the limitations of the system, and the what was the other one, the client control considerations document, which are two things that as you're reading through the contract, you'd highlight, knowing that this is one of the questions that you have to review, and therefore then you're marking this as yes, but you're also documenting, laying the paper trail that yes, because the vendor owner is aware of where this refers outside of the contract, blah, blah, blah. Now, I want to make sure you realize that the limitations of the system are the limitations of any IDS IPS system. And so, we kind of kept this list that, we had a client one time that failed a social engineering test, and their CIO, who, didn't last there very long, but anyway, she was the one that failed the social engineering test. And so she was trying to make it out that somehow we were supposed to prevent that from happening. No, when we're watching your network, we can't prevent your users from giving out information that they shouldn't be giving out. Okay, and so anyways, that kind of stuff. Now that's the outrageous example, but there's other really important stuff in there, such as, if you have a branch, where the data from that branch is not going through any of your central routers and switchers and stuff that we're plugging into, we're not going to see that data. That's a limitation of the system. We need to map out where that visibility is poor, right? And so anyway, that's the kind of stuff that we're talking about there. It's what you need to really kind of get to the bottom of when you do a contract review. I didn't say this was going to be easy, but do you also realize that your lawyer probably isn't the best person to do that part of contract review? And again, your lawyer, though, makes sure that the contract is sound, that you can live up to your ends, that there's not any kind of stuff in there that like might be a trick or whatever. So I'm not saying your lawyer shouldn't review higher risk contracts. I'm just saying that law firms don't usually look that detailed to make sure that we fully understand the limitations of the system and that they're reasonable, and that the client control considerations are reasonable. It's not the lawyer that's going to be able to tell that. And do we know that we're enforcing the client control considerations? What that is that's a list of everything that we're saying, hey, this system will be secure as long as your people are using strong passwords, as long as you notify us whenever you have turnover in the people that are on the calling tree, that sort of thing. Next question, number 5, and I realize, wow, we're only at question 5, but this is going to go quicker once I start, explaining or stop explaining stuff that we only have to explain once. Does the contract include any ancillary services that may come along? Well, there were several, and those again are mapped out in that SLA, and then you can track down the actual language to them where it says if the SLA includes this. Does the contract articulate the obligations of the financial institution? Well, throughout we probably do. Okay, I would have to say that we probably say a client will help us install the sensors. That if you don't, it's going to cost you money. And by the way, when you were going over the expenses, another thing that we should have also made sure that the vendor owner was aware of is that if Infotex ships us the sensors and we install them, we can save money on travel expenses. Make sense? Now, a lot of our clients, and by the way, when we have the setup meeting, if we're not confident that you've got good, bona fide, qualified IT people doing that end of the work, we're probably going to insist on coming out and installing the sensor ourselves. We work with a lot of real small banks, and we're starting to pick up some even smaller credit unions where you'd rather pay us to come out and install the sensor because you don't want us to wonder if it's the way the sensor was installed when we start getting into tuning and we run into some issues. Okay, and so, but as you're going through the contract is where you're highlighting this, and then when you actually come across the question is when you're documenting it. I hope this is helpful to you. Just so you know, if you've already downloaded this spreadsheet, you can probably fast forward the movie to the questions that you might have if you're dying and having a hard time staying awake during some of these more mundane questions. Does the contract articulate the obligations of the financial institution? So I was answering that question, got distracted. That happens to me often, sorry. But throughout this, we're probably articulating what we've tried to do, and I don't know if we've done a good job on, but is that we've then circled back around. And if you see something like this, boy, this is really what you want to make sure your vendor owners are looking at and agreeing to. And so we're just going to basically say vendor owners have approved the language on page, what page is that? 12, right? And so then we're going to say yes. Or we might, what we might get in there is that vendor owner, let's just say who user's name. I mean, realistically, I don't know if you're going to say vendor owner, right? John was not aware that he had to supply an encrypted tunnel and is looking into the costs to do that, but says we'll absorb it, or something like that. You're going to have surprises as you go through the contract, in my opinion. And the reason why I hold that opinion is because we try really hard not to have any surprises. And then we worry that our clients sometimes will worry because they'll be like, oh, you want me to have an encrypted tunnel? Yeah, that makes sense. Really, it was in our contract. Can you read the contract, please? You know what I'm saying? And so I've come to realize that whoever's the one that reviews the contract is the one who's going to make sure that the vendor owners actually know what they've agreed to get into. And really, a lot of that is mapping the obligations to the persons. Now, at a smaller institution, you're probably just saying, hey, our network support provider is Acme IT Resources, Inc., and Acme is going to handle everything, right? In our larger organizations, we do see that the ISO thinks that he or she is going to be able to handle everything. And next thing you know, once we've got that calling tree, we're actually mapping out the tuning period responsibilities. So very often, this is something that doesn't get done before the contract is signed. And so let's just assume that this time the team is confident that the responsibilities will be mapped out as part of the tuning process, and therefore this is not finished. But we think the likelihood of it causing issues is pretty low because you see right in the contract that part of the tuning process is, it spells out that we're going to do a tuning process, and part of the tuning process is to create that calling tree, which is, and the decision tree, by the way, which is where the responsibilities are mapped out. And by the way, a lot of our clients or prospective clients will have already seen that decision tree, so they see where it says, if this happens, then Infotex will respond by this and inform this person who will do that, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's part of the tuning process. Therefore, we think the likelihood is low. But boy, if we don't get that done, the impact could be to all of our customers. And so therefore, the impact's pretty high, even though the likelihood is low. Do you see how some of this really isn't reviewing the contract as much as it is reviewing whether we're properly responding to the contract? The contract should define minimum service levels. One of the things Infotex is pretty proud of is that international companies just simply do not have the lawyers that'll allow them to, how do I zoom in? I'm using, every time you sit down to your computer, it's different in some way, and I'm not seeing how to zoom in on this contract here. I think it might be over here. Yep. So anyway, I just want to zoom in enough so that you can see this page here, and I'm going to walk you through this real quick. So this is the parameters. This is, we got to check to make sure this is accurate, right? Somewhere along the way, hopefully, the contract review will kind of cause us to check to make sure this is accurate. But then there's startup fees, there's monthly fees, and that sort of thing, right? And so what was I checking for anyway? The minimum service level agreements. And so one of the things that we're really looking at here is, this is what we're going to be doing, but is there a minimum service level? Very often our clients will call up and say, hey, what actually are you promising? Is there any kind of a guarantee that you're going to catch these incidents or whatever? And so what I always do is I always basically say, read the language surrounding the required response time. And then we spend a little bit of time explaining to our people, look, most of our incidents were responded to automated, in milliseconds. And so we don't include that in our average, but our average response time right now to non-technical, non-blockable incidents, to intrusion detection, not intrusion prevention incidents, is about 15 minutes. We have some clients that require us to guarantee in writing 1 hour response. Most of our clients have 4-hour response guarantees, and then some of our clients have 8-hour response guarantees. None of the international players that compete with us will give you a guarantee in terms of how much time it's going to take before they are out of compliance with their service level agreement. And by the way, they might offer that now. It's been 2 or 3 years since I've actually looked into that, but it was 10 years after we did it that they still hadn't been doing it, and it makes sense. We can do it because we've got a small enough client list where it's easy for us to manage the risk surrounding this. But if you read the agreement, something that's very important that the vendor owners need to know is that, yes, we do a good job of defining those. However, the prerequisite sign-off forms need to be in place prior to the SLA being enforced. And that's important because what we're basically saying is that until we have those signed prerequisite forms on file, we're not promising anything, actually, is what the agreement says. Because we've learned the hard way that there's a lot of stuff that the client needs to do that if they don't do, we're not really able to meet our client, our promises. And so those are all listed in the client responsibilities. One of the client responsibilities is to make sure that the prerequisite sign-off forms are all signed by both the provider and the client. And so is the vendor owner aware of this? Is the vendor owner aware that we want email to go down a VTON, that we want all processes, and has the vendor owner had a talk with Infotext by what they mean by tools and processes? Do we have the most recent perimeter tests in our portal? Do we have a network map? Has it been updated? Is it finalized? Have we trained the client on the portal and the specific use based on the client's technical capabilities and the size of the institution of that portal? And has Infotext scanned the IP range to make sure that our IPS, and that's just for IDS, by the way. There's also a different prerequisite sign up for the event logs that are coming off of your servers. And so we need to make sure that the vendor owners are aware of that. Let's just say in this case that, yeah, the vendors owners are. We do a pretty good job of helping the client or the prospect understand the expectations going in. So I'm hoping this would be a 1. It might end up being just an educational thing for your vendor owners by the time you get to reviewing this part with them, and they might have to circle back to the vendor a few more times just to make sure they understand what they're reading there. That's why we do a contract review, to make sure the vendor owner understands what they're getting into. Has the vendor agreed to comply with the GLBA regulations? And this is really, I'm not in the interest of time. We have a whole section that I'm going to review in more detail later. Suffice it to say, yes, we do. Does the contract include an agreement to comply with Bank Secrecy Act, Anti-Money Laundering, OFAC? I'm not sure about that one. I'm hoping we do. I wouldn't be surprised if we don't. We're not really that familiar with those regulations or laws, or I know what they stand for. Let me see here. BSA. What was the other stuff? I mean, let's face it. If I'm not in compliance with one, we're not in compliance with the other. OFAC. I don't even know what OFAC stands for, but I'm starting to conclude that we're, and again, you are, in the interest of time, I probably should go through this more, closely. But I'm telling you, I'd even say, hey, and by the way, I know some of your contracts you're looking at are like hundreds of pages long. And you're going to very often ask the vendor, hey, let's go over this. I've been able to answer what I can find, but there's a lot of stuff I can't find yet. And so in this case, I mean, we can't find evidence of this. Okay. And so what I would say when my vendor contacts, or when my prospective client contacts me, or, usually they'll contact the guy we have handling, the engagement. And then that person will probably get with me saying, hey, here's something we haven't heard, but the Infotex contract, they can't find where it is in compliance with BSA AML. I would spend more time looking than I just did. And when I didn't find it there, because I'm starting to think we probably don't. And the reason why is because I can't agree to complying with a law that I don't really understand. And as far as I'm concerned, I know I have auditors tell me annually, actually several different audits, that we are in compliance with Graham-Leach-Bliley. And so I'm going to basically tell my clients that I think that's not applicable in this case, that we try, sometimes we do accidentally end up with NPI or PII. If one of your employees sends Social Security number an email, we're going to see that, and it's going to end up in our alert, but we purge that monthly. And so the exposure is really 31 days or less. And then beyond that, we don't get PII anyway. And then we have all these controls in place, blah, blah, blah. And so I think you're hearing me kind of freak out about the fact that, hey, we're not in compliance with this. But what I would do is I would encourage your vendor owner to just look at that as being not applicable. And if the vendor owner agreed with me, if you agree with me that it's not applicable, then you would put it 1 here in the non-applicable column. However, I also don't want to lead you, I don't want to lead you with the impression that you should say that's not applicable. I mean, it's your bank, it's your compliance program. You might say, hey, no, they're not complying with that. And I don't know, maybe your compliance officer, whoever's reviewing the contract, is like, I think that's a big deal. And so if it's a 10 or above, that means we're going to bring it to the board's attention that, hey, Infotex is not agreed to comply with these laws. And so the vendor owner might want to circle back around to Infotex again and say, hey, Dan, just so you know, my compliance officer is finding this to be a high risk finding, something that's worthy of reporting to the board. Do you want to try to rectify this? And then I'll have to be honest with you. I probably would say, boy, would I be able to give you a statement that you can bring along with that report to the board? Because I would like to define why I believe that it's not applicable, or, at least I feel like the likelihood of it causing issues is pretty low, and the impact is more of a compliance impact than anything, in my opinion. So anyway, didn't really spend that much time on that, but let's just leave it at that. So that way, if nothing else, I can show you how to have findings go into the vendor risk determination table. Done it though. Okay, but this question isn't, are we maintaining policies and procedures? This is, are we requiring Infotex to maintain policies and procedures which address the financial institution's right to conduct periodic reviews so as to verify that the vendor is in compliance as expected? I feel like that's part of our 4 agreements then. So back to our 4 agreements. We kind of ran across that when we were looking for the policy and procedure thing, right? And so what we're really looking at there is these up here. And so, so the 4 agreements: we promise to never disclose information. We promise to inform you if we accidentally or maliciously have a breach that would affect that. We promise to maintain controls, and then provider promises to participate in due diligence inquiries as required by client to demonstrate the existence of controls required by promise number 3. And so I feel like we are agreeing to this one here. Now, the periodic review, if you interpret this to mean that the bank can come in and audit us, well, there's a different question there. And I'm here to tell you that no, we get audited by 3 different auditors once a year, and then the FFIEC comes in and examines us every 2 years. They're talking about changing that to be every 3 years instead of every 2 years, but that's enough auditing for us. And as you're a bank, you get audited all the time. We have decided we can't let individuals come in and audit us, even if they agree to pay for the audit. We have talked about maybe creating an addendum to saying unless there's a breach or something, because I can see that as being a worthy time to have someone come in and audit us. As it stands right now, though, that we cannot let an individual bank interrupt our business processes with an audit. We will share the results of our audits with banks, by the way. Does the contract require that the vendor security controls are regularly reviewed and validated by an independent third party as per the cybersecurity assessment tool? And so what we're really saying is, does this requirement, is the contract requiring us to have our own audits, I'm thinking. And so let's see what it says about audits. Now, this is just basically saying that we're not going to share anything unless we're, asked in an audit. The client does agree to accept our executive summaries of audits, by the way, as long as we're in the TSP examination program. And so what that basically means is, Infotex gets examined by the FFIEC once every 2 years. They might move it to once every 3 years. And so there's a third party that's looking at all of our audits, both internal and external. And so you should be able to use the TSP ROE, the Technology Service Provider Report of Examination, to tell how well our audits are. And so as long as we're in there, we'll give you executive summaries, but we don't feel like you should have the whole audit. It just exposes us to risk that is unnecessary in our opinion. But back to the actual, contract we questioned. Are we required to be audited? Let's just use the word audit, not audits. Now we've got 8 things. That's just, saying that, hey, we can give information to third parties. Client waives right to any audit. Any right to audit is what we're actually saying there. In terms of you having the right to audit us, in terms of the bank having the right to audit Infotex, that's the exact opposite of what that question is going to ask for. Provider will perform regularly scheduled tests, ensuring enforcement of controls necessary to keep the 4 promises listed above. I feel like that's a promise. I feel like that is requiring us to be reviewed regularly. So I'm going to say we're in shape there. Now you can actually go out to the information security booklet and get exactly what language you need that you can send to your vendor who might be saying, well, we think we're in compliance with, the FFIEC guidance, but we're not going to get audits to prove that. You know what I mean? And so that's where you can get the information to kind of help with the conversation there. We're at question 13 and we got 52. So we're a fourth of the way through. Does the contract require the vendor to inventory sensitive information types? I do believe that we do. I know we do that. It's in our due diligence package, but I don't know if our contract requires it. It requires the vendor to inventory, to provide change, let us know when the system changes. Inventory. I'm not seeing in there. I found it. Sorry it took so long to find this, but where it's actually worded as provider will inventory all information collected that is classified as critical NPI. And so Infotex actually has a 5th classification. We have, public, internal use, confidential, and then critical. but any information that we get our hands on that belongs to our customer's customer is critical NPI. We do also assign critical NPI as a classification to other documents that are, air quotes around the words top secret. And we inventory that information. That's why I figured it must be in the contract, because I know it's a big pain in the butt, but we inventory the information. We keep track of where it is the whole time we have it, and then we send the affidavit of destruction once we've gotten it out of our control. We do not want to keep critical NPI. Again, we send affidavits of destruction. We try to make it a pain in the butt for us to actually have that information. It kind of helps make sure we keep it out of our possession. So I'm going to say, yes, we're doing that. Does it prohibit disclosure? Yes. We need to read the whole question, right? And yes, we are prohibiting disclosure. Does the contract require a vendor to fully disclose any breaches? That was that second promise there. Actually, I put a 2 in there when I said second. Does the contract cover responsibility? I apologize for the spelling issues in our template there. Of direct or indirect security incidents and vulnerabilities. Is this in the contract as well as the service level agreements? And so really that's that second item as well. Does the contract cover the responsibility for notification? And innocent in the, we feel like that's being covered by our promise number 2. We're going to notify our clients of any breach. We have the insurance that would cover any kind of notification that the client would need to do because of our work. So we believe that our contract covers that. You might, as I say that, you might feel like it needs to be more specifically worded, and that's what that addendum template's for. Does the contract require a vendor to maintain controls that will prevent a breach, allow the vendor to recognize when a breach has occurred, and allow the vendor to respond to such breach, which would include notification and institution? And we really feel like that's that third promise in the 4 promises. And by the way, if you don't see when you're reviewing a contract specific language about that, that might be when you just go ahead and grab this section and send it to your lawyer and say, hey, how do I answer this question given this language? It cuts down. You don't have to have your lawyer read the whole contract. Sometimes they will say, hey, I need to read the whole contract. I just can't give you advice about one section of it. But you might just zoom in on this if you feel like it's not making clear this language over here. We feel like we needed to actually restate our confidentiality agreement based on the OCC guidance to ensure that, yes, what we mean by this up here is that we're going to notify you if there's a breach. And we're going to maintain the controls that'll allow us to notice that, hey, there's been a breach. Because that's usually what gets brought up in litigation, is that you were supposed to notify us, and then the person that was breached says, but I didn't know I was breached until such and such a date. We want them to have monitoring systems in place so that we can tell that we are breached. Does the contract document the financial institution's responsibilities for managing any device that secure connections to the vendor? Well, actually, our sensors are the devices that create that VPN between us and the vendor. We do require the client to work with us because there's some work that they need to do on their end. And, that's part of actually our prerequisite sign-off. We need to have a VTON before we can make sure they send email down to VTON. And so by implication, I would say that the contract is requiring us to manage those sensors. We actually retain ownership of the sensor so that we are the ones that manage those sensors. And so I would say that one's a 1 there. Does it specifically say that? No. But by implication, it requires us to manage the sensors, and the sensors are what actually manages the secure connection. We haven't had yet, but I would not be surprised if somewhere down the road somebody wants us to create an affidavit that makes that more clear, that Infotex is managing the secure connection. Does the contract require a vendor to participate in a risk-based due diligence process? Well, that's that promise number 4. Does the contract address the vendor's responsibility for backup and record protection? I don't know. That's a good question. It should, I would hope. Backup. Provider will maintain appropriate backups of all systems necessary to deliver services, and then we'll test those backups. So I feel like that's pretty good. We can say, yes, we're in compliance there. Does the contract require the vendor to test business continuity? Well, that was the second part of that statement. Does the contract include specifications of any audit reports that are to be provided to the financial institution? Well, I don't know if you remember when we were there, but it basically said the contract limits such reports to executive summaries, while Infotax is in the TSP examination program that is maintained by the FFIC. I don't know. I feel like that's pretty good, but you know, I mean, what you can know by this is that, well, I mean, what you don't know is, does this mean that if they are not in the TSP exam program, we get the whole report? That might be the question you come back and ask. And by the way, if someone comes back and asks, I'm going to say, well, you know what? A, we're planning to stay in that program, but B, we'll have to cross that bridge when we come to it, because I'm still concerned that giving you my whole audit report could expose ourselves to unnecessary risk. That would be how I replied to that. But as it stands right now, I feel like we can say that the contract is requiring that, or is specifying those audit reports. If appropriate, does the financial institution conduct periodic and performance audits of the vendor services and systems and that sort of thing? I will say that we do allow our vendors to come on site, both to our office and to our 2 data centers, if they want to do an on-site visit. And that's happened probably a dozen times in the last dozen years. But, you know, auditing our systems, we specifically say you don't have a right to audit. I don't really feel like that's what this is talking about. If the vendor has a SOC 2, this definitely requires or qualifies, but other audit instruments should be considered. And so really the question is that if you're considering us a critical vendor, the other thing that would need to be documented here, and again, we don't have our due diligence packet, but we really need to document, Infotax does not have a SOC 2. They have one for their 2 data centers, and then they have a set of affidavits, audit executive summaries, and the TSP ROE as assurance documents. And by the way, I mean, if you look at all those affidavits, blah, 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 we actually make sure they line up well to our SOC 2 review checklist, expected controls for an MSSP. And so that's a different process here. But the contract is specifying, we'll at least get you our audit executive summaries. And we do have that SOC 2 on our sub-service providers. I feel like that we're in compliance with the contract here. Right to audit, does the contract establish? No. And, you know, we are not in compliance with that. And so I'm just going to say that, hey, the impact of that's great. And I'm going to say it's an 8 because I don't know how you feel about that. In my opinion, you're probably not getting the right to audit very many institutions. They're probably pointing to their own audit programs. I don't know, but I could be wrong about that. It's been in guidance since 2013. I will on occasion ask my clients, are you getting that? They're saying no, but they're also kind of a little bit afraid that I'm going to smack them for it because it's in the OCC guidance or whatever. So we don't really dwell on the subject very long. Does the contract establish? I just quite frankly feel like it's a little bit intrusive of the government to try to get a bank to have the right to audit a individual organization. But that's my own opinion, and we should stay away from that for the rest of this webinar. On question number 23, we still have half our questions to go, right? Does the contract establish if the financial institution will accept audits conducted by the vendor's internal? And yes, it does establish that. Well, I mean, now this one, you might not want that. This is one of those questions that I kind of worry about the way the question is worded, because we're saying, yes, it does establish that the vendor, the financial institution will have to accept our executive summaries. But the words there are will have to, right? Accept our executive summaries. And really then we're saying that the financial institution reserve the right to audit? And so, no, we're saying no here. And so once again, I guess we're at that 8 and 5. I don't really understand the difference between these two questions. I think this really is more of a more specific version of this. And so no, we're not providing that in our contract. And so I'm giving it the highest risk ranking, just so you know. I really feel like these two should be non-applicables. Are you getting the right to audit your core provider? Once you get that right, then maybe you can start asking those that don't have possession of the entire treasure trove if you can audit them. I don't know. The next one here, though. Does a contract require the vendor to maintain any types of insurance? We do. I'm not exactly sure what our contract says in that regard. Provider will also maintain adequate insurance, provide evidence of such insurance, and inform clients anytime there are material changes. I like that. So I like it because, yes, we're doing pretty good on that one. And that's good because I don't think you like my answer to the one above, right? To the right to audit question. So, so yes, I want to try to get that second sentence out of there. And that's a 1. But and then, by the way, I'm sure you're not going to put an exclamation point after the yes. I apologize for being happy that I'm in compliance with that part of the contract. Does it require the yes? Yeah, we just kind of read that. To notify. And then of course we got extra questions. Does it require the vendor to provide evidence of coverage where appropriate? And I believe that I read that too. Provide evidence of such, yes. Does the contract allow for subcontracting or assignment? Is this agreeable? So this is another one of those questions where you can say, yes, it does, because we do. We actually have a 1099 employee, been with us for, gosh, probably 8-9 years. And so technically that's a subcontractor. And so if you look at, I think there is a section on subcontracting maybe. What's wrong with me? Will it not? Well, maybe not. I thought we had some kind of a section here at the beginning of the agreement that assigns. That's a lawyer way of saying subcontractor, right? Provider may assign or subcontract, and we used the dash. That's why we couldn't find it. And so we're basically saying that. Is it agreeable? Well, let's read it. Provider may assign or subcontract and obligations after written notification. Well, that's nice. So we have to notify our clients. And then pending client's written consent, which will not be unreasonably refused. So the client actually has to give us consent to subcontract. All subcontractors employed by a provider will be bound by the terms and conditions of the contract. Appropriate non-disclosure agreements and background checks are conducted upon all subcontractors. Client acknowledges the customized nature of the agreement. And so we're saying, hey, you can't assign your end of the agreement to, you can't buy managed services from us for, First National Bank of Nowhere and then resell that to Bank of America. Right, so I think that makes sense. So I'm saying, all right, but is it agreeable? And so I'm hoping that you'll agree that what we're talking about there is agreeable. I now know we send letters out to our banks listing the only we used to have more than one more than one 1099 employee until we hired 3 of the 4, and so we used to send a letter out, saying who they were, and now I know why, because that's part of that contract. So does the contract specify any activities that cannot be subcontracted? And it doesn't really do that. I don't think it basically specifies the activities that cannot be subcontracted. So that's not a complete. I really don't know what that. I can see how if you're hiring an organization to do A, B, and C, you don't want them, subcontracting A and B for some reason, because you want to make sure you're getting, I can see this with selling loans, gosh, if you sell your loan to, bank A, and then they sell it to bank B, who sells it to bank C, your customer's going to hate you by the time they sell it to bank D. So that might be where that's at. In our case, it's hard to imagine where we would be subcontracting anything other than the watching of the alerts. So I don't know. To me, that's kind of a compliancy thing, and I think the likelihood of that causing issues is pretty darn low, unless I'm misunderstanding, what a client would want. But do you see how this also could bring up if you felt like the risk was high because there's something that you're concerned about that I'm not seeing when I answer this question, it causes a discussion between you and your vendor, and the vendor can maybe even write an addendum, which I'd be happy to write, to say the only time we're actually subcontracting our managed security work is when we have 1099 employees, because we can find people that are already security professionals that would be more than happy to work for us on a part-time basis, blah, blah, blah. So does the contract state that the vendor is liable for activities or actions by its subcontractors? Yes, I believe that it does. Let's just make sure. I feel like that's kind of the thing that you're going to want to have, this specific language. So provider, well, we're binding the subcontractors by the terms and conditions. Are we responsible for what they do? Yes. Oh, good. Provider is liable for all activities of subcontractors used in any engagement with the client. You see how that works? Gosh, you'd think I'd be familiar enough with my agreement to be able to say yes, but you got to review, you got to read the language. But anyway, we do state that, thankfully. We would be responsible. I feel like we are responsible for anything that happens in the engagement. And so, but I'm glad that the contract says that, because that's something that I would definitely want to have in the contract. Does the financial institution reserve the right to terminate the contract? Well, we have interesting termination. We give you the right to terminate the contract for any reason. We feel like what we're selling is a good night's sleep. But one of the things that's kind of weird about us is that if we give you a discount because of the fact that you're agreeing to 3 years, we want that discount back if you do terminate the agreement. And so the operative word there is without penalty. And so I believe it's if for any reason with penalty, but if there's a breach, I think there's no penalty. So let's just look. Let's look for the word terminate. I'm just going to look for termina. It's in there a lot. It's in there 12 times, and we haven't even got to one yet. So let's come up here and start over. Termina. All right, well, we're on 3 there, but this must be 1. So early termination. So it's basically providing for discounts, early terminate, blah, blah. That's just telling them we're going to do it. The agreement may also be terminated as per the terminate. So it's just referring to a termination clause. Let's just kind of go down this way. Upon determination, that's different. Early termination. So discounts in consideration of a time commitment will be recouped as provided in an addendum in the event. So there's an addendum that spells that out. Early termination clause. Though this contract includes discounts for commitment of 3 years, and actually this one was for 5 years. We didn't, this is a sanitized thing, so we slapped the 5-year on top of a 3-year agreement. Either party may, with a 90-day notice, terminate the contract. Notice must be in writing and mailed via certified mail to an appropriate address. Actual termination will be 90 days after the end of the month in which the notice was received. And by the way, that's kind of because when we've only had a handful of people end a managed services contract with us, and it was when they were bought by a bigger bank, or in one case, a hospital was bought by a bigger hospital. And so a lot of this language is just to try to help make sure that, hey, You know, I mean, we still want to get paid if we're still providing the service to a different company, that sort of thing. And so I feel like that's why we basically say established when the termination, you know, gets, you know, that we bill you for 90 days after the month that we receive the termination notice. We remove all the sensors. We sanitize all the devices that are returned. We provide an affidavit that, you know, we've destroyed all the information within 60 days of the response. But we're not really saying anything about the ability to terminate without penalty. So let's keep going. That's just the determination. That's the, you know, destruction of information. And so, did we not get the affidavit in here? So let's just kind of look. I believe the affidavit's on the second to the last page. And I'm having trouble navigating the agreement. Yeah, I was going to say there's more than 12 pages in this thing. So I don't know what's going on with this new version of whatever I'm using to watch PDFs. But if you look here, this is the addendum that addresses the additional discount and consideration for a 3-year commitment. And then it's basically saying, however, if you terminate the agreement early, we want that discount back, is what our approach is to that. And so what I would do if I was a person reviewing the contract is I'd say no, because there is a penalty. Well, and then, you know, I'm just going to pretend like you agree with, you've had a conversation. While we agree that return of discount is fair for any reason, if there is a breach, we should be able to terminate immediately without penalty. And then, you know, a vendor owner is seeking an addendum. And then I'd have to, you know, I'd probably want consideration back. You know, I'd want basically, I'll write the addendum, but that would be after some forensics expert, you know, develops a report that says it was indeed Infotex that caused the breach. Because very often there's confusion as to what caused the breach. Did Infotex miss this, or was it something that happened on the inside network, blah, blah, blah. And I, you know, I mean, I don't even want to go too far into that because, you know, there's reasons why sometimes you never know what caused the breach. And so I'd want to protect myself on that. But as it stands right now, you might end up saying, hey, that's a pretty big risk. I feel like that one might be one where, hey, we need to get the board, or, you know, we need to make sure the board is aware of that particular issue. Moving along. If the contract allows for the assignment of services to subcontractors, does the contract require that any sub-service providers be subject to the same confidentiality, control, and assurance agreements inherent in the contract? Yes. I don't know if you noticed that, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to show it to you. Does the contract require sub-service providers with possession of access be required to provide assurance documents directly to the institution? That one is no. But vendor has agreed to an addendum for any sub-service providers that are not individual persons. So in other words, I can see that if you want to see, and we actually do already provide the SOC 2 on our data center, which is a sub-service provider. We'll provide that to our banks. But we can't provide the background check, the financial, you know, credit review, all the work that we do annually, random, you know, tests and all that kind of stuff of our 1099 employee. That would be an invasion of that person's privacy. And so I'm hoping that after you looked at that, you realize, okay, that's more of a compliancy thing. The likelihood of it causing a problem is relatively low, especially if we get that, you know, addendum in place. But by the way, once we get the addendum in place, we can say, hey, this is complete. But it's not complete until we get the addendum in place. Does the contract, and by the way, I've seen people say, well, I'm going to say the likelihood of that is a 7, so it stays on my list until I get that contract in place. And I can see that as well. Does the contract include the documentation of ownership and license of financial institutions information? Well, and I believe our contract, I'm not going to look for it, but we don't install anything that requires the financial institution to own a license. We own a license for everything that needs to be licensed. And our audits review that, of course, in the asset management portion of our audits. Does the contract afford appropriate warranties on the part of the vendor? Well, we do have a warranty section. I'm not sure if you're going to say it's appropriate or not, but I'm going to say that you're going to, for now, I'm just saying, hey, got a warranty section, it's appropriate. Does the contract establish financial institution owns the data collected by the institution? Well, the alerts, I believe our contract says that the alerts are owned by, I'm just going to say own. What do we got there? There's 18 owns, because I'm going to say own with a space in front of it and a space after it. Now we got whittled down to 5. All right, own premises, that isn't it. Own assurance, own external port scans, own security information. Gosh, I can't even remember what the question was anymore. Does the contract establish the infinite owns the data? Oh, okay. Doesn't look like our contract establishes that the client owns the data, which would be an easy fix for us to do. It basically acknowledges that the client owns their own PII, but that's not strong enough in my opinion. So I'm going to say no. Provider has agreed to establish this in an affidavit. And I'm almost realizing that, hey, we're going to circle back around this and probably send an affidavit out to all our existing clients for some of these issues where, we can fix them. And so I'm thinking, hey, this one, could get us, if we don't own the data and then they don't have to, protect it, right? Or, so I feel like, hey, we better get that on their radar. I'm going to make sure the board's aware of that kind of an issue. Does the contract include the term of the contract? And I happen to know it does. I'm not going to waste our time here. Does the contract automatic? Yes, it does. We've got a bank that's been with us month to month. They signed in 2003. They've been with us month to month since 2004. A lot of our clients will come back around and say, let's renegotiate the contract. We did write an addendum to the month-to-month client a while back saying, hey, all these new provisions that we weren't offering are true for you. The contract should address the conditions under which the financial institution may terminate the contract. We've done that. We're basically saying for no reason, and so I feel like we're in good shape there. The contract specify proper disposal. Yeah, we're going to give you an affidavit. Anytime we collect critical NPI, we will dispose of it and provide affidavits to that effect. And then anytime we, and by the way, the critical NPI affidavits are actually kind of sent globally. We also audit everybody's sensors once a year, and we send that specifically because everybody's sensors are different. And it's just basically an automated purging process that's tested. We actually test the purging process monthly, even though the purging process is a monthly process. But that's the kind of thing you're going to want to get to the bottom of and make sure that your vendors are doing before you can say, yes, they're doing it. And our contract actually specifies that we're supposed to do that. And then also, if you end the contract, we then provide affidavits after we've properly sanitized. And what we do is we pull the, we wipe the drives, we pull the drives, we drill the drives, and then we send them to a shredder. The contract should include a provision for dispute resolution, but we will not specify that, by the way, up here, that we wipe, pull, drill, and send to a shredder, because we weren't always doing it that way, A, but B, there might be a better way to do it somewhere down the road, and we don't want to paint ourselves into a corner. But the contract definitely says that we'll sanitize the drive. The contract should include a provision for dispute resolution. I believe it does. You're probably not going to like it because we basically say that all disputes should be resolved in the Tippecanoe County court system, which is where our business office is. but it does do it. So this is one of those questions that is, yes, the contract addresses this. It doesn't address arbitration. Don't think, I'll check, but I'm pretty sure that our attorneys want to go directly to court. But I feel like it doesn't have, I feel like the guidance isn't requiring that to have an arbitration provision. It's just basically saying that if you notice an arbitration provision, that's what we're talking about here. And then, will the vendor continue providing the solution through the resolution period? You know, assuming that we're still getting paid. I don't know. I don't know how to search for that. But that must be something that is a term that we're not. I'm pretty sure we're not providing that term. So we're going to have to say yes to dispute resolution, but no provisions to provide service through term of resolution. And so, you know, I don't know what the. I mean, boy, if you're suing, or, you know, if there's a lawsuit, do you really want us watching your back? You know, I mean, I don't know. So I feel like the likelihood of that being an issue is pretty low, and the impact of it's pretty low. If we're in a lawsuit, you should probably find somebody else to manage your security monitoring posture. Does the contract require the vendor to send an affidavit or some other memorandum? Yes, and we do that. Does the contract address inland? Yes, it does. If the vendor wishes to include a limit, it's in there. We did include one. And is the limit acceptable? Well, it's my understanding, at least according to what my lawyers are saying, is that we're basically saying that if we cause any kind of breach, that the most you can sue us for is all the money you've spent up to date. And so that bank that's been with us month to month since 2003, they can probably sue us for a lot of money. But if you just signed up with us yesterday and then we cause all kinds of damage, and we haven't even invoiced you yet, according to our contract, you can't sue us for anything. Okay, but it's also, I understand, that's standard contract language that everybody knows that part of the contract is not enforceable, is my understanding. And so what I would ask for in my review of contracts is is it something beyond that? Is it saying that we're not responsible for breaches on your network? Because if it says that, wow, now I'm starting to get to where we can't sign this contract. But if it's the standard language that's in every contract that the lawyers insert in it so that it sets it up to where they, can have a more organized legal proceeding or whatever, then I'm going to say, yeah, it's standard, it's acceptable. The other thing I'm going to check is what's the limit of liability on their insurance? Because if it's, far less than I think it's going to be, which is, a different review, but, then I'm going to say it's not reasonable. In this case, I'm hoping that most people will agree that our limit of liability is reasonable. I haven't ever heard anybody come back and say, hey, our lawyers want you to change that. If you're governed by the OCC, it's got to have a question. So we just put it in all our contracts. There's an OCC section about, we are under OCC supervision. I always wonder how many vendors actually understand what that means. We already subjugate ourselves to the OCC supervision because we're in the TSPROE examination, so they're supervising us pretty closely. They're actually our lead examiners for 4 years in a row. We're now rotating back to the FDIC, and I found the whole experience to be probably the best thing that ever happened to our company, and so I'm not complaining about it, but I just wonder if your other vendors understand what that means when you have them added into the contract or when you put it in as an addendum. But suffice it to say, if you're not an OCC bank, if you're an FDIC bank, you would put not applicable here. I'm going to pretend like you're an OCC bank. I also noticed that there's a one in there, which I feel like our boilerplate must be queuing up. Hey, some banks say this is not applicable. I don't know if I agree with that. I feel like it is applicable because there might be unreasonable limits that our vendor owners should be made aware of. Does the contract establish what it would cost if the financial institution wanted to execute early? Yes, we do establish that. I feel like this question, though, should be, and is that reasonable, right? And so, or is the vendor owner aware of it? And so this goes back to vendor, you might want to, make sure the vendor owner was made aware of this termination costs or termination clause or whatever. Okay, so again, get back to we're trying to lay a paper trail here too of the awareness process, which the contract review is. Does the contract establish both parties' responsibilities for providing, receiving, and retaining information throughout the engagement? It's all over our contract where, we're supposed to provide an annual review meeting. We're supposed to provide client control considerations. The client's supposed to provide us a network diagram once a year. The client's supposed to provide to us the results of any penetration tests after the test. We certainly don't want them to even let us know about the penetration test until after the test, blah, blah, blah. So we're in good shape there. Does the contract establish that the vendor is responsible for compliance with all applicable laws? Well, yeah, actually, I think that's what we say is yeah, to the extent that it collects information covered, well, we agree to comply with it, right? So to me, that's our applicable laws. I don't think it says all applicable laws. And so, no, it certainly doesn't say that. And so this is another one of those. It's going to have to be up to your judgment. To me, I'm saying we're good there. But since above we decided that no, there's an issue with that because they aren't complying with BSA or whatever. If you're a BSA officer, thinks that's a big deal and you want to have that in the report to the board, well, this is how you lay the paper trail as to how you're going to lay that. You're going to report that Infotex doesn't want to comply with, the Bank Secrecy Act or whatever. And this is really, I feel like what we're saying is we're only agreeing to comply with HIPAA and Gramm-Leach-Bliley. State laws, do we agree to comply with them? Well, we definitely comply with Indiana state law, but I don't think we're agreeing in our agreement to comply with, Ohio state law, and we have clients in Ohio. So let's just see. And we're basically saying that you have to sue us in Indiana. But no, we're not agreeing to comply with state law. And so, I feel like this is definitely not a one, but I also feel like the likelihood of it really being an issue is lower. I don't know what I put up above, but I'm going to put it there for now. We're not a foreign-based company, so that's not applicable. Does the contract establish who's responsible for handling cut? We never, this one's usually not applicable unless you got a help desk that your customers interface with. So, we never deal directly with the customers. The geeks we have watching alerts, if you know what it takes to watch the alerts coming off a network, you wouldn't want those people talking to your customers. Anyway, they're proud to be considered to be geeks. So they're very, very technical people, very good people. Does the contract stipulate geographic limitations? I don't think so. U.S. I'm pretty sure we keep all of our data in America, but we also know somewhere down the road we might engage with somebody that's using AWS or whatever. And so we're saying no, we don't want to open that can of worms. I looked in the contract just to think, see if maybe we say something like that, but so we're basically saying no, and provider is worried that somewhere down the road they may use a provider like AWS that may store data outside of US. However, currently provider keeps all data in US. And so anyway, I mean, I feel like we can't say a 1 on that. To me, I don't know what you're going to say to the impact or likelihood. To me, it's a compliance thing at this stage. And don't get me wrong, if we found out that, oh, Infotex is keeping its data in Syria or North Korea, then obviously it's more than a compliance thing. But, you know, Infotex is in the business of securing data, and if we was to put data in an unsecure place, you know, I mean, that would be really dumb. Of course, you can't count on that, but what's the likelihood? That's really where your judgment comes into place. I'm going to put a 5 in there just because I don't want to, you know, influence you to think it's a lower likelihood. I personally believe it's a much lower likelihood that it's going to cause a problem, or else we'd probably be putting it into our contracts and making sure that everybody knows that we can't use AWS, blah, blah, blah. Does the contract address vendors' responsibility for backup and record protection? Well, we already talked about that. I'm saying yes. Does the contract address how to deal with failures to comply with the contract? The notification of financial difficulty? No, we're not including any of this stuff, in my opinion, in there. And so, so far, the first 2 I read, I feel are kind of like stuff we would do, where we do kind of with the assigns, you know, address, you know, some of that. But I'm going to say some is addressed, but not all. And I don't know, you know, to me, that's a hodgepodge of really OCC I's dotting and T's crossing. So in my opinion, it's compliancy stuff. You know, why would we not want to make our clients aware of any of this stuff? So, you know, I don't know. To me, I'm going to give it a 5. You know, I don't, can it cause real damage to customers? I mean, over time it could. So I'll go ahead and give this a 4. But I really don't feel like it's worth wasting your board's time with bullet points like that. If I did, I'd give a 5, or I'd give this a 6. You know what I mean? And that's what I want to stress. This is a prioritization exercise. I don't know if you're noticing, but it's centering around, is this something really worth reporting to the board or not? At least on the likelihood side of things. The impact is pretty hard to argue, impact ratings, but likelihood is really where the judgment comes in my opinion. Does the contract specify how data will be returned to the institution? We believe so. And have we compared the contract to the rest of the due diligence packet? Well, I have in my own mind. I'm hoping that you would say yes on this, because if not, I don't feel like you're following the, you know, advice we're giving in this webinar. And so we now have the contract completely reviewed, treating Infotex as a critical vendor. You know, if we felt like Infotex was not a critical risk vendor, maybe we would use this more simplified checklist. The other thing is that maybe we should create a deployment checklist. This is one we've created to assist our clients, but this is just based on reviewing the contract. I'm not going to have time in our webinar to go over this with you, but suffice it to say that there ended up being 39 to-dos that came out of reviewing the contract to get through the tuning period. Fortunately, Infotex will walk your people through it. They won't even realize that they've done 39 things by the time we're done with the tuning period, but it'll put you in a good position. So that is actually the review of the contract. And so what I'd like to do now is just kind of return back to our PowerPoint. I'm not sure if Michael's awake yet or not, so I'm just going to kind of...
No, Dan, I'm here with you. Although I think we do have a question from an insomniac. Maybe they are trying to get some sleep. But what do you charge to do, what does Infotex charge to do contract reviews?
Well, that's actually a good question, and it's not with SOC 2 reviews. Boy, we got them down. They pretty much take the same time. I mean, we like reviewing SOC 2s more than we do SOC 1s, that sort of thing. But you know, our price is $600. You know, it kind of averages out over all the SOC 2s that we review. With contract review, you probably wouldn't still be awake here if you didn't know that it could take hours to review a contract. So first of all, we do not like reviewing core contracts. We can work with you on it, but we feel like if we work with you on it, it's because we're on a team that includes your lawyer, and that your lawyers looked over the contract, and that we know all the parts of it and that sort of thing. And so we don't even want to do core review. For everything else, it all depends on the contract. It's an hourly rate. We charge $150 an hour to do it, which is a lower rate compared to what we do with most of our, assessment work. And it really should be that contract where, boy, we might have our lawyer look at it from legal reasons, but we need to have somebody look at this contract from a security perspective because it looks weird or whatever. And typically, I'd say about $600 to $800 is what it costs for us to get through a moderate-sized contract and do the full review and dot all our I's and cross all our T's. So if you're a client of ours already, talk to us about it. If nothing else, we can, make you watch this movie and help you with any questions you might have after you do the review yourself. So good question. Any other questions, Mike?
No, I believe that's it, Dan. So thank you everybody for your attendance today. Sorry we went a bit long, but like Dan said, if you've dealt with contracts, I'm sure that you're kind of used to it. And if you came to get a nap, then I will speak slowly and try not to wake you. Again, thank you today for joining us, and Dan, thank you.
Well, thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.
Adios.
When you view an InfoText webinar or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you're agreeing to the terms posted at the web page listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what InfoText presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with InfoText webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but InfoText reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our transfer of copyright agreement at the webpage listed in this slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the web page shown on this slide.